Welcome to the quiet town of Ashford, a place where the night is never quite as it seems. For years, it has stood, nestled in the shadows of its own secrets. But tonight, something is different. The blood moon rises in the sky, casting an eerie, crimson light over the town, and with it, the boundaries between the living and the darkest fears begin to blur. Tonight, we explore the chilling story of a town that was forever changed by a celestial event, a night where people's deepest desires and fears became more than just thoughts, but living, breathing nightmares. So sit back, relax, and let the quiet tension of Ashford pull you into its dark embrace. This is the story of the Blood Moon, a tale where everything you fear might come to life. And when the clock strikes midnight, only one thing remains certain: no one will ever be the same. Now, close your eyes and let the story unfold, but remember, once you enter Ashford, you may never be able to leave. The town of Ashford had always been quiet, unassuming, with its weathered streets and charming cottages. Nestled beneath the endless canopy of trees that seemed to stretch for miles, it was the kind of place that felt frozen in time, like something out of an old postcard. Nothing ever truly happened here, at least not in the way that made people take notice. But tonight, the town felt different. The air was thick, heavy with anticipation. The streets, usually quiet, were eerily still, and the townsfolk moved about with an odd sense of urgency. The sky had turned a strange shade of crimson, casting the whole town in a haunting light. It was almost as if the sun was sinking, but the shadows it cast remained long and stretched, like the hand of something watching, calm, slightly foreboding. The town had been abuzz with talk of the blood moon for weeks. Some said it was a sign of bad things to come, a harbinger of something darker than anyone could fathom. Others shrugged it off as just another astronomical event, something for the town to gossip about. But on this particular night, as the full moon rose higher into the sky, there was no denying it. Something was wrong. Evelyn Thomas, a lifelong resident of Ashford, stood outside her cottage, staring at the sky. She could feel the change in the air, the way the wind seemed to whisper against her skin, as if it carried secrets she wasn't meant to know. She had lived here all her life, and yet tonight, the town felt like a stranger to her. The moon hung low, casting a strange, blood-red glow over everything. The streets, the buildings, the trees, all of it bathed in that eerie light, as if the world itself had shifted. Evelyn had heard the warnings, just like everyone else. The old tales, the stories of strange happenings whenever the blood moon appeared, but she had always dismissed them as nothing more than superstition. After all, it wasn't as if evil could truly be called forth by a celestial event, right? Yet, even she couldn't deny the unease that gripped her now. The air was too still, the night too silent. Evelyn took a deep breath, shaking off the strange feeling in her gut, and headed inside. The living room was dimly lit, a few candles flickering on the mantel. The television was on, but the sound of static was all that filled the room. The regular programs had been interrupted with news reports about the blood moon, each one more unnerving than the last. They spoke of ancient prophecies, of long-forgotten rituals, of the darkness that would rise with the moon. Despite the rational part of her mind telling her to turn off the television and go to bed, Evelyn couldn't help but watch. The reports spoke of something awful awakening. The moon had been unpredictable in its rise, moving across the sky in a manner that seemed to defy logic. The more she watched, the more the feeling of dread settled in. The moon wasn't just a spectacle tonight, it was an omen, a warning, but of what she wasn't sure. Across the room, her brother John was sitting by the fireplace, absent-mindedly, flicking through a book. He didn't seem to notice the chill in the air or the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than normal. But Evelyn could feel it, the pull, the oppressive weight of something waiting. Something hungry. Evelyn, softly, almost to herself. Do you feel that? Like the air's pressing in. John glanced up from his book, but only briefly. He didn't seem bothered by the strange atmosphere in the slightest. To him, the blood moon was just a curiosity, something to talk about over drinks. John casually, "Oh, come on. It's just a lunar eclipse, Evelyn. Nothing to get worked up over. It'll pass, like everything else." Evelyn could only nod, but her thoughts didn't align with her brother's casual dismissal. She had seen the faces of the townsfolk as they went about, their evening eyes wide with uncertainty, lips trembling with words they didn't dare speak aloud. Dark, reflective. It wasn't just Evelyn who felt the shift. There was something unseen sweeping through the town, a collective feeling that no one could quite place. The people who lived here had been sheltered from the world, safe in their familiar routines. But tonight, the familiar had become alien, and even the most skeptical among them couldn't ignore the tension that hung in the air outside. The town seemed to be at a standstill. No cars moved down the streets, no children played outside, and the usual hum of the village was completely absent. The world felt as though it had been suspended, waiting for something that no one could predict. As the minutes stretched into hours, the darkness outside the window seemed to grow deeper. The clouds above the town shifted, moving strangely. They formed patterns that looked almost deliberate, as if they were being shaped by some unseen hand. The wind picked up again, but this time it didn't feel like wind at all. It felt like a breath, hot and heavy, exhaling from somewhere far deeper than the atmosphere. Evelyn looked back at her brother. His eyes were fixed on the pages of his book, but she could see the unease in his expression. He was trying to hide it, to ignore the mounting pressure in the room. He, too, could feel the weight of the night. Evelyn's voice barely above a whisper. "I think something's coming, John. I don't know how, but I feel it. Something's going to happen tonight." John closed the book and turned to her, his face serious now. For the first time that night, Evelyn saw the same unease reflected in his eyes. John, softly, "I know. Evelyn, I feel it too." Suddenly, the doorbell rang, breaking the tension. Evelyn jumped, her heart racing. The sound of the bell echoed through the empty house, the sharp tone like a signal, a warning. Evelyn stood frozen for a moment, her breath caught in her throat. It was an odd hour for visitors, and she didn't expect anyone to be out there at this time of night. But as she moved toward the door, she felt the presence of something far larger, far more dangerous than what could be waiting on the other side. She opened the door, only to find no one there. The wind had stopped, and the fog rolled across the front steps, so thick it seemed to swallow the entire world. There was no one, no sign of any person, just the empty street. The town, once so familiar, now felt like a ghost town, silent and empty. As Evelyn closed the door, her eyes caught a glimpse of something in the distance, a flicker of movement on the horizon. The silhouette of a figure, barely visible through the fog. But when she looked again, it was gone, swallowed by the mist. Evelyn shut the door and turned to her brother. But her thoughts were interrupted by a low rumble, a sound like the deep growl of thunder. The town had begun to change, and so had the night. The blood moon had risen, and with it, the darkness had come. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, almost too slowly for Evelyn's comfort. The town of Ashford once so quiet and peaceful, now seemed to breathe with an unsettling stillness. The fog outside was thick, swallowing the streets and creating an almost otherworldly atmosphere. As midnight approached, Evelyn felt an ever-deepening sense of dread, a feeling that something ancient and terrible was slowly, inexorably awakening. Every passing minute seemed to stretch longer than the last. The blood moon hung in the sky like a great, silent eye watching over the town. It illuminated the streets with a strange, red glow, casting long shadows and making even the most familiar places feel foreign. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that the world around her had somehow shifted, as though time itself had become unhinged. Inside the cottage, the air had grown heavy. The windows were shut tight, but the oppressive atmosphere inside felt almost like it was pushing its way through the walls. The temperature had dropped significantly, and Evelyn pulled her sweater tighter around her, but even that didn't seem to help. The cold was unnatural, seeping into her bones, as if the night itself had turned against her. Evelyn could hear the faint sound of whispers again, just like before. At first, she thought it was the wind, the house settling under the weight of the fog. But this time, the whispers were clearer, distinct. They were coming from somewhere in the house, a low, unintelligible murmur, like a voice from the past, or a voice that didn't belong. Evelyn turned, her eyes darting around the room. She could feel the shadows stretching, warping, as if the room itself were being distorted by something unseen. The flickering candlelight cast strange shapes on the walls, making the room feel like it was alive, as though it were breathing with her. She stepped forward cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers were growing louder now, almost pleading, but still too faint to understand. She followed the sound, her feet moving almost on their own, until she stood before the mirror hanging on the wall. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. Her eyes widened in shock as she saw a shadowed figure standing just behind her. The figure was tall, draped in tattered robes, with no features, just a shadow with glowing eyes. It wasn't her reflection, it was something else, something alive. Evelyn spun around, her breath catching in her throat. But when she turned, there was nothing behind her, just the stillness of the room. Her heart raced, and she shuddered, as if the temperature had dropped even further. The whispers were gone, but the chill remained. Her heart was racing, her pulse quickening as she looked around the room, desperately trying to make sense of what she had just seen. There was no shadow, no figure, no sign of any presence yet. The feeling lingered. The feeling that she was not alone, that something unseen was watching, waiting. Her hands trembled as she tried to steady herself, but as she turned back toward the window, the fog outside seemed to shift. It wasn't just drifting anymore. It was moving, swirling like a living thing, spiraling toward the center of the town. The moonlight reflected off the mist, casting eerie red shapes that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Evelyn's mind raced, but it couldn't keep up with the images unfolding before her. The fog outside seemed to move with purpose, as if it were alive, and the town itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Meanwhile, in the heart of Ashford, the same strange phenomena were happening. People walked the streets, their faces pale, their eyes hollow, as if they were being drawn towards something, as though they were caught in some unseen pull. A woman passed by Evelyn's window, her hands trembling at her sides, her eyes fixed on the sky above. A child's laughter echoed faintly in the distance, but there was something unnatural in the sound. It was too high-pitched, too distorted. Out there in the town, the darkness was taking shape. People's darkest fears and desires were beginning to manifest. The whispers weren't just in Evelyn's house. They were in the air, in the town, swirling like the fog itself. Everyone, from the oldest to the youngest, was vulnerable to the pull of the blood moon. Evelyn moved toward the door, instinctively drawn to the town square. Her heart pounded as she stepped outside, the air even colder than it had been inside. The fog thickened around her, but she kept walking, her steps slow and deliberate. Every instinct told her to turn back, but there was something drawing her toward the center of the town. As she reached the square, she stopped, her eyes scanning the eerily quiet street. A street lamp flickered, casting brief glimpses of shadows that seemed to shift and move in the fog. The town square, usually full of life, was now silent, empty except for one figure standing under the lamp. It was John, her brother, but he wasn't the same. His face was drawn, his eyes wide with an expression she had never seen before: fear. But something darker, Evelyn calling out to him, voice trembling, "John, what's happening?" John turned slowly toward her, but his eyes were empty, as though the light inside him had been extinguished. The shadow behind him seemed to grow, like something was rising out of the ground, a shape shifting within the fog. The figure was taller than him, its body indistinct, but its eyes burned through the mist, glowing like embers in the night. Evelyn reached out, her voice barely a whisper in the air. "John, what's happening to you?" But as she called out to him, the world around her seemed to fracture. The blood moon was at its peak, and the curse was awakening, its grip tightening around everything. The fog thickened in the streets, swirling like a living thing, and the crimson light of the blood moon bathed the town in a sinister glow. Evelyn stood frozen at the edge of the town square, her heart pounding as the figure under the street lamp, John, stared back at her, his eyes wide and empty, lost in some otherworldly trance. The fog seemed to press in on them, its cold fingers creeping across her skin. Behind John, the shadowed figure continued to grow, its form becoming more solid, as if it was stepping out of the very darkness itself. The shape loomed over John like a silent predator, its eyes glowing a bright, fiery red that cut through the fog like twin beams of light. Time seemed to slow, the night stretching out before Evelyn like a nightmare unfolding before her eyes. John's gaze was distant, as if the town, the fog, and even the blood moon had taken him. The figure behind him was no longer a shadow, but a presence, its form twisting and writhing in the darkness, alive with malice. Evelyn's voice trembling, "John, please, wake up, you have to snap out of it." John's lips parted slightly, as if he were about to speak, but no words came. Instead, his eyes flickered, as if he were fighting against something unseen. The shadow behind him pulsed, its tendrils wrapping around him like a shackling force, pulling him closer to the figures. Evelyn took a step forward, but as she did, she felt the ground beneath her feet shift. The very earth seemed to groan, like it was alive, struggling to contain something that was breaking free. She stumbled back, her heart racing in her chest. The town had become a nightmare, a place where the darkest desires of its people were now given form. All around her, the town was changing. What had started as a quiet, peaceful place was now turning into a land where people's deepest fears and secret cravings bled into reality. The blood moon was no longer just a celestial event, it was a force that had unlocked something dark, something that could not be contained. The fog thickened, moving with a life of its own, and the town was being swallowed whole by its manifestations. Evelyn's eyes darted around, and she could see it in the other townspeople. Their desires had begun to take hold. At the far end of the street, she saw Lucy Harrow, the baker's daughter, standing frozen in the middle of the road. Her hands were shaking, her face twisted in anguish. The next moment, Evelyn's breath caught as Lucy's desire, her need for approval, came to life. Lucy's image distorted as if the very air around her had bent and reshaped. Her body stretched and contorted, her arms elongating unnaturally as she reached for the sky. The thin, fragile woman was now a giant, towering over the buildings. Her mouth open wide in a soundless scream, her eyes filled with horror at what she had become. She was a reflection of her deepest desire to be seen, to be adored, but she had never imagined it would be at such a cost. Evelyn felt her stomach churn. This wasn't just a hallucination. The people of Ashford weren't just experiencing some collective delusion. They were being transformed by the blood moon. The darkness within them had been released, and there was no way to stop it now. Suddenly, there was a screech from a nearby alleyway, and Evelyn spun toward the sound. The townspeople were running. But it wasn't fear that drove them, it was something else. Desire, revenge. The darkest parts of themselves had been exposed, and they were being consumed by it. In the alley, two men, James and Richard, lifelong friends, were now locked in a frenzied struggle, fighting over something neither of them could remember. Their greed had become physical, each man's body contorting with desire to possess the other, to control. The power struggle was a battle of wills, driven by their hidden need for dominance. But it wasn't them anymore. These men were now merely puppets to their own greed. Evelyn turned back to John, but he was no longer there. The figure that had once been just a shadow was now a tall, monstrous entity, its form flickering between solid and spectral, like a nightmare trapped in the moonlight. Its face was a blur of darkness, but Evelyn could feel its gaze piercing through her, cold and indifferent. Everything was happening at once. The town was unraveling. People's darkest desires, their fears, were coming to life. The blood moon had unleashed something ancient, something that could not be stopped, and now it had taken root in the hearts of the people. The streets were filled with madness, with violence, with terror, and Evelyn was caught in the middle of it as the last remnants of humanity seemed to fade away. Evelyn crying out, desperate, stop, please, wake up. This isn't you, but her words fell on deaf ears. The figure before her, a shadow of desire, had taken hold of her brother, and it was too late to turn back. Evelyn felt herself being pulled toward the heart of the town, to the center where all the manifestations were swirling, where the darkness was strongest. She had to act, she had to do something, but the blood moon was consuming everything. Time was running out. The town of Ashford was no longer a place of simple lives or quiet corners. The streets, once familiar and welcoming, were now filled with unnatural distortions. The fog had taken on a thick, suffocating quality, swirling in patterns that seemed almost intentional, like it was alive, breathing along with the town. People who had once been a part of the community were now strangers to each other, lost in a haze of desire and fear, their faces twisted by the moon's influence. Evelyn walked through the streets, her feet heavy with the weight of what she was witnessing. The world around her seemed to be coming undone. People had become shadows of their former selves, consumed by the very things they had feared most. And those who hadn't yet succumbed were now trapped in an endless nightmare, unable to escape the cycle of desire and fear that had gripped them. As she moved deeper into the town, Evelyn could see the shattered faces of the people around her. Men and women who had once been familiar, but now seemed unrecognizable, their eyes wide with terror or greed. The blood moon had unlocked something deep within them, a force that could no longer be ignored. The very ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, and she could hear the distant sound of screams, though no one seemed to be aware of the others around them. A woman ran past her, her face frozen in fear, her breath ragged. She wasn't running from anything visible, but Evelyn knew she was running from something inside herself. Her fear had manifested, taking form in her mind, and now it was chasing her. Evelyn watched as the woman collided with a streetlight, her body jerking back as if struck by some invisible force, and then she collapsed. Her eyes were wide, filled with terror as she whispered incoherently, it's coming for me." Evelyn's pulse raced as she knelt beside the woman, shaking her gently. But the woman's eyes locked onto her, and she pulled away, her body trembling violently. Woman voice hoarse, frantic, it's here. The thing that I've been hiding from all my life, it's come to claim me." Evelyn could hear the woman's heart beating wildly, but before she could ask more, the woman suddenly stood up, her hands grasping the air in front of her. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and her body seemed to move unnaturally, as if some force was controlling her. Her fear had brought to life the very thing she dreaded most, and now it was consuming her. The woman screamed, a raw guttural sound that filled the empty streets. Her body twisted as if she were fighting against something invisible, but the fear was too strong. The air around her grew thicker, and her body jerked forward as if pulled by an unseen force. Evelyn watched in horror as the woman's face morphed, her features became distorted, stretched by the weight of her own fear. Then, in a final scream, the woman crumpled to the ground, lifeless. Evelyn staggered back, her breath catching in her throat. The town around her seemed to be alive with frenzied energy, people torn apart by their own fears, running from their own demons. In the distance, she could see the shapes of shadowy figures moving through the fog, their faces twisted by the things they had been hiding from. It was as if the town itself had become a mirror, reflecting all the darkest desires and deepest fears of the people who lived there. The clock tower in the center of town seemed to pulse with the power of the moon. Its tolling had become a signal, a marker of time, but now it seemed to be more than just a sound. It was a call, summoning forth the shadows, the manifestations of fear that were now feeding on the town's inhabitants. Each chime was a reminder that the cycle had begun. The blood moon had unlocked something powerful, something dangerous, and it was now impossible to stop. As the clock struck the hour again, Evelyn felt the earth tremble, and she turned toward the town square. There, in the middle of the fog, she could see figures emerging, tall and indistinct, like phantoms, but each one was different, shaped by the unique fears of the people. Some were monstrous, others humanoid, but all were drenched in darkness. They were the manifestations of the town's worst nightmares, now freed and hungry. The people of Ashford were not safe. The blood moon had brought them face to face with their worst nightmares. The townspeople had thought they were protected, hidden away in their safe little world, but now they were being consumed by their own darkness. And as the clock struck again, it wasn't just fear that filled the air, it was the hunger of the nightmares, the desires they had hidden deep inside, now set free. Evelyn stepped back, her heart racing as she turned to run, but the figure she had seen earlier, John's shadowed form, stood in front of her. He was no longer himself. The fear had taken root in him too. His eyes, once full of life, were now empty, the dark energy of the blood moon swirling in his pupils. Evelyn pleading, "John, please, it's not you, you're not like them." John's face twisted, his lips curling into a grin that wasn't his own. His voice came out low and distorted, as if it were being pulled from him by some unseen force. John, whispering, eerily calm, "You can't escape, Evelyn. None of us can. The moon has opened the door, and now, we're all a part of it." Evelyn's body tensed as she realized the full extent of what was happening. The fear, the desire, the nightmares, they were alive now, and there was no going back. The town's curse had been unleashed, and it was devouring everything in its wake. The clock tower tolled once more, its chimes echoing through the streets, and as Evelyn turned to run, she could hear the sound of the town's terror growing, louder, as if the nightmare was now chasing her. The blood moon had risen, and Ashford was no longer a town, it was a hunting ground. A place where people's darkest fears had become flesh, and no one was safe. The sound of the clock's toll reverberated through the town, a deep, resounding chime that seemed to echo from the very heart of the earth. The streets of Ashford were no longer recognizable. The fog had thickened, and the once quiet town had become a labyrinth of shadows and fear. As the midnight toll rang through the air, something within the town seemed to shift. It was as if the chimes themselves were awakening the darkness that had laid dormant for centuries. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she looked around the town square. The figures, monstrous and nightmarish, had taken shape, their forms twisted by the darkest desires and fears of the townsfolk. The streets were filled with these manifestations, and their hunger was palpable. The very air seemed to hum with their presence. The blood moon was at its peak now, casting everything in a crimson glow, but the moonlight was no longer comforting. It was oppressive, suffocating, as though the sky itself was closing in on them. Evelyn's mind raced. The fear that had taken root in the town, now a living thing. Her brother, John, stood in the middle of the square, his form distorted by the blood moon's influence. His eyes were empty, and his face twisted into an unnatural grin. The man she had once known, her brother, was now lost to the power of the moon. "John," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling, but her words seemed to vanish in the thick fog that surrounded them. Her brother's form had become a shadow of what he once was, and the darkness in his eyes was growing stronger. The blood moon had consumed him, as it had with so many others. His very presence had become part of the nightmare that now gripped Ashford. John's voice was a low, inhuman growl as he stepped toward her, his movements jerky, like he was being controlled by something otherworldly. His lips parted, and for the first time, Evelyn saw the hunger in his eyes. Not for food or drink, but for something deeper, something dark and uncontrollable. "John," his voice distorted, "it's too late. Evelyn, you can't stop it. We're all part of it now. The moon has claimed us." Evelyn stumbled back, but her body felt like it was moving through thick molasses. The ground beneath her feet felt as though it was shifting, like she was walking on the edge of a precipice. The air had become heavy, like it was pressing down on her chest, making each breath harder than the last. The clock's toll rang out. Again, each strike echoing louder than the last. The sound of the chimes felt like the heartbeat of the town itself, thudding in time with the darkness that was consuming it. The blood moon had unleashed something ancient, something primal, something that could not be undone. The chimes were marking the final moments of the town's existence as it had once been. Evelyn took another step back, glancing around at the chaos unfolding around her. The town's residents were lost, their fears manifesting in terrifying ways. People ran, but there was nowhere to hide. The nightmares that had taken form were now everywhere, chasing the townsfolk with relentless hunger. Some of the townspeople were fighting back, their fears turning into violent actions. Others were screaming, their voices swallowed by the terror that had consumed them. Evelyn looked back at John, whose form had now become an unrecognizable figure, his body shifting between states, human, shadow, and ghost. The town around him seemed to warp, like the very fabric of reality was being torn apart by the blood moon's influence. Evelyn knew that the final toll was approaching, and with it, the town's fate. She had to make a choice. The clock tower had been silent for so long, but now it was calling to her. The moon was reaching its peak, and the power it had unleashed was coming to a head. There was no running anymore, no escaping the nightmare that had descended on Ashford. As the clock tower rang its final chime, the ground beneath Evelyn's feet rumbled, and she felt an almost physical pull toward the town square. She had to stop it. She had to end the curse before it consumed everything. But what if she couldn't? What if the blood moon's power was too great? Evelyn's breath quickened as the fog thickened around her. The town was no longer just a place, it was alive, breathing with the darkness of the blood moon. The manifestations of fear and desire that had plagued the people of Ashford were now overrunning the town, and the walls seemed to close in around her. It was as if she were trapped in a dream, a nightmare that would never end unless she stopped it. Evelyn crying out, her voice filled with desperation, "Stop. Please, I have to stop this." But the voice that answered was not John's. It was a low, rumbling growl coming from all directions. Voice from the shadows, deep and echoing, "You cannot escape, Evelyn. The moon has already claimed what it desires." Evelyn turned in a panic, but the figure of the clockmaker was there, standing just beyond the fog. His face was hidden in shadow, but his presence felt like the very essence of the tower, the anchor that had held the curse in place for so long. Evelyn had seen him before. The clockmaker was not just a ghost, not just a manifestation. He was the key to the tower, to the curse that had haunted Ashford. He was part of the cycle. He had bound the town to this eternal torment, and now he was here to claim his final toll. Evelyn voice cracking, filled with dread. "You did this. You cursed the town, trapped us here." The clockmaker's voice was cold, detached, as if he had been waiting for this moment for centuries. The clockmaker low, foreboding the moon, called, "Us all here, Evelyn. We are bound by the clock, by the toll. But you are the one who will complete the cycle. You are the key." Evelyn stood frozen, her legs unsteady beneath her. She felt the weight of the tower's curse pressing down on her, suffocating her. The clock's toll had reached its final strike, and the blood moon's power was at its peak. With the final chime of the clock, the town was sealed in its fate. The manifestations of fear and desire were at their strongest, and there was no going back. The cycle had begun again, and only one question remained. Would Evelyn complete the ritual and end the curse? Or would the town continue to live in the grip of the blood moon's influence? The clock tower's chimes echoed for what seemed like an eternity. Each toll was a hammer blow against the very fabric of reality, a marking of time that was no longer controlled by the laws of nature. Evelyn's mind raced, but her thoughts felt heavy, muddled by the fog that had now consumed the entire town. The town square was a horrific scene. Figures stood frozen in time, distorted by their own dark desires and fears. Some of them had been transformed into monstrous forms, others into creatures of twisted reality. Ashford was no longer a town, it was a nightmare. The town had descended into chaos, and with it, Evelyn knew there was no turning back. The blood moon had reached its zenith, and the forces it had awakened were now consuming everything. People were running, screaming, but they were being dragged into their own nightmares. They were trapped in a cycle, the same cycle that had cursed Ashford, the same cycle that Evelyn had to end if she had any hope of saving what was left of the town. Evelyn stood at the edge of the town square, watching as the figures of people's desires and fears clashed in the streets. She could hear the cries of those who were still fighting, but the horror that surrounded them was too great. They were not fighting against each other, they were fighting against the darkness within themselves. Unleashed by the blood moon, the town had become a battleground, and there was no escape. The air was thick with dread. The streets were filled with strange and terrible manifestations, creatures with flesh made of shadow, people who had become monsters in their own right, and whispers that seemed to crawl out of the very ground beneath Evelyn's feet. The fog itself had become an extension of the curse, and it was pulling everything into its depths. Evelyn turned to face the clockmaker, whose presence had become a constant weight in her mind. The figure stood at the base of the clock tower, his form flickering between solid and ethereal, like a ghost that refused to leave. His eyes burned with an otherworldly fire, and his mouth curled into a smile that was anything but comforting. The clockmaker, calm, almost mocking the town, is lost, Evelyn. You can feel it, can't you? The curse has been here long before you arrived. It's in the very bones of Ashford. The clock's toll has bound us all, and now the blood moon has sealed it. There is no escaping what's been set in motion. Evelyn took a step forward, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She felt the weight of the tower's power pressing down on her, but there was no turning back now. The clock continued its rhythmic tolling, marking each second like a heartbeat that grew louder in her chest. Evelyn, her voice firm, but trembling, no. I won't let this happen. I will stop this curse, even if it means I have to destroy everything to do it. The clockmaker's smile widened, as though he had been waiting for her to say those words. The clockmaker softly, almost pleased, you've finally come to understand. Sacrifice is the only way. The moon has shown you the truth. It has shown all of us. The town is already doomed. You cannot escape it. Evelyn shook her head, her mind racing. She couldn't allow the curse to claim the town. She couldn't let the blood moon's influence continue, destroying everything in its wake. But as she looked around, she realized that the town's fate had already been sealed in ways she hadn't fully understood. People had been lost to their own darkness, to their deepest desires and fears. The blood moon had unleashed something far older than Evelyn had realized. It wasn't just a curse, it was a trap set long ago by the clockmaker himself. The ritual, the tolling of the clock, the sacrifices, it was all part of a plan that had been set in motion centuries ago. And now, Evelyn was the final piece. She had been brought here for a reason, but that reason was not to free the town, it was to complete the cycle. The figure of the clockmaker seemed to grow taller, as if it were becoming part of the very clock tower itself. The air around Evelyn thickened, and she could feel the darkness seeping into her veins, like a cold poison spreading through her body. The moon's light felt like an iron grip, dragging her toward something inevitable. Evelyn's voice strained, but determined. No, I won't let you win. I'll break the curse, or I'll die trying. As the words left her lips, the ground beneath her feet rumbled violently. The clock's chimes reached their peak, and the air around her shattered, as if reality itself was breaking apart. The figure of the clockmaker was no longer just a man, it was a force, a being tied to the very essence of the curse. The town had become him, and he had become the town. Evelyn knew she had only one choice. The cycle had to be broken. She had to face the clockmaker, face the curse, and end it all. The blood moon's grip had grown too strong. There was no escaping. The terror that had overtaken Ashford, the clock tower, the toll, the corset, all led to this moment. One final decision, and the fate of the town, the lives of the people, and the town's future rested in her hands. The final strike of the clock rang out, louder than ever before, and Evelyn felt the force of the curse surge through her. The town was closing in around her, its desires and fears pulling her into the darkness. The clockmaker's figure was now part of the very clock tower, his presence growing stronger. And with each passing second, Evelyn's last chance to stop. The curse grew smaller, more fleeting. The final chime of the clock tolled through the empty streets, its sound ringing out like the last breath of something ancient. The oppressive air around the town began to shift, the cold fog that had consumed the streets starting to recede, leaving behind a town that was eerily still. The blood moon, now a mere red sliver, hung low in the sky, casting its dying glow. Over Ashford, it was as if the night had finally reached its end, but the lingering sense of dread remained. The town was no longer the same. The blood moon had come and gone, but its effects would not be so easily erased. The town of Ashford had been marked by its dark journey, its people changed forever by the fears and desires that had come to life. The curse was broken, but the damage was done. Some had survived, others had been consumed, but all of them carried the weight of the nightmare that had taken hold. Evelyn stood in the middle of the square, the clock tower looming behind her, its face now silent, no longer tolling. The fog had dissipated, but the air was thick with a strange stillness. Everything had returned to normal, or at least what could be considered normal after the events of the night. But Evelyn knew the truth, nothing would ever be the same. Somber, almost melancholic, her body felt heavy, as though it had been pulled through a time she could never get back. The horrors of the blood moon were fading, but in its wake, there were scars. The town was empty now, in more ways than one. Some had fled, others had disappeared, and those who remained were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. But Evelyn could feel it deep in her bones. The blood moon had taken something from them all, something that could never be replaced. As she walked through the town square, her footsteps echoed against the cracked pavement, the silence almost unbearable. The streets were quiet, too quiet. The whispers that had once filled the air were now gone, but so were the laughter and the familiar voices. The town was a ghost of its former self, its residents haunted by the shadows of their own fears. Quietly, with a sense of loss, Evelyn walked past the remains of the once vibrant marketplace, now empty and broken. The shops that had once bustled with customers were boarded up, their signs faded and worn. The town had become a shell, its heartbeat silenced, its future uncertain. But it was more than just the buildings that were left in ruins, it was the people. The blood moon had drawn out the darkest aspects of their souls, and for some, that darkness had consumed them entirely. Evelyn reached the town's central park, where a small memorial fountain stood. It had been there for as long as she could remember, a tribute to Ashford's founders. But now, as she stood before it, she couldn't help but notice how it had changed. The water in the fountain, once clear and soothing, now ran thick and dark. It shimmered in the dim moonlight like liquid nightmares, swirling as though alive with the very essence of the town's horrors. Lo, haunting the fountain had always been a symbol of hope, a place where families gathered, where children played. But now, it felt like a memorial to what had been lost, to those who had fallen under the weight of the blood moon's influence. Some had survived, but others had given in to the darkness that had come with the moon's rise. Evelyn sat by the fountain, her mind drifting back to the events of the night, the moments when she had felt as though the world was collapsing, when the curse had been at its strongest. She remembered the clockmaker, his words, and his chilling promise. She had made her choice. She had broken the cycle, but at what cost? Reflective, the blood moon had taken more than just the town's peace. It had taken lives, memories, and the innocence of a community. But it had also freed the town from the curse. The clock tower had fallen silent, and the spirits of those who had been trapped by the moon's power were now at rest. The town was no longer under the sway of the moon, but Evelyn could feel the weight of the sacrifice. The town's freedom had come at a price. As Evelyn stood, she glanced at the distant hills, the fog now gone, leaving behind only the dark silhouette of the forest. The trees loomed like ancient sentinels, watching over the town, reminding her of the dark legacy that remained. She knew that the blood moon would return one day, and that the cycle might repeat. But for now, Ashford was quiet, its fate sealed by the choices of the past. Final, haunting the cycle had ended, but the legacy of the blood moon would live on in the memories of the town's survivors. Some would forget, others would be haunted. By the night that the blood moon had risen, Evelyn had broken the curse, but in doing so, she had become part of the story. The blood moon would always be a part of Ashford, and the town would never truly be the same again. As Evelyn turned and walked back toward the town's edge, the first light of dawn began to pierce through the sky, washing away the final traces of the blood moon's crimson glow. The town was waking up, but Evelyn knew that the darkness was still there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the next blood moon to rise. The sun had barely risen over Ashford, casting a soft golden light that contrasted sharply with the red glow that had bathed the town just hours before. The streets, once choked with fog, now lay quiet. The town, or what remained of it, was calm, but the weight of the previous night was still palpable. The blood moon had passed, but its impact could still be felt in every corner of Ashford, like a lingering shadow that refused to fade. Reflective, somber, the blood moon had risen, and with it, the town had been thrust into a nightmarish realm where fears and desires took form. People had been changed, twisted by the very things they had once hidden. The blood moon had broken the curse, but in its wake, it left something more haunting than any of the town's past secrets, an indelible mark. Ashford would never be the same. Evelyn stood at the edge of the town square, staring at the clock tower in the distance. The tower, which had once told every hour, now stood silent, as if it had fallen into a deep slumber. The clock face, though still intact, no longer glowed with the eerie light it had during the blood moon. But Evelyn knew the truth. It was not just the clock that had been silenced. The town had changed too. Its heart had been broken, and it would never beat the same again. Quiet, haunting as the clock tower faded into the background, Evelyn couldn't help but wonder what would become of Ashford now. Would the town's residents ever truly heal from the horrors they had endured? Could they return to normal after having seen the depths of their own souls? Or would the blood moon's legacy continue to haunt them forever? She turned away from the tower and made her way down the quiet street. As she passed the cottages, she saw familiar faces, people who had once been part of the fabric of Ashford. But now they walked with their heads bowed, their faces shadowed. Some had lost their loved ones, others had simply been broken by the events of the night. Even those who had survived were not the same. Their eyes carried the weight of what they had witnessed, what they had become. Melancholic, reflective people say that time heals all wounds, But Evelyn knew better. Time might pass, and the town might rebuild, but it would never be the same. The blood moon had opened a door to something otherworldly, and no matter how hard they tried, the scars of that night would always remain as she walked through the town. Evelyn saw small groups of people gathered, speaking in hushed voices, their eyes darting around nervously. No one dared speak openly about what had happened, but the shadows of fear hung over them, and the memory of the blood moon's terror was forever imprinted on their minds. Final, haunting, some would try to forget. Some would leave, seeking refuge in places far away, hoping the horrors of Ashford wouldn't follow them. But others, the ones who had been touched by the moon's power, would stay. They would try to rebuild, to find some sense of normalcy, but they would never forget what had happened. The blood moon had unlocked the darkness in them, and that darkness would never fully leave. Evelyn stopped at the edge of the town, near the old forest where the fog had first rolled in. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches stretching into the sky like skeletal fingers. It was here, in this very forest, that the blood moon's power had begun to rise. The very land beneath her feet felt heavy, as though it had been tainted by the events of the past night. Final reflection, Evelyn couldn't help but wonder, had the curse truly been broken, or had it merely shifted? The town had been freed from the moon's influence, but what of the darkness that still lingered inside its people? What of the fear and desire that had been awakened and given form? Would they ever truly escape the cycle, or was the blood moon always meant to return? She looked back at the town one last time. It seemed to breathe, still alive, still trapped between the shadow of the past and the uncertain future. Evelyn knew that the town's true test was yet to come. The blood moon had left its mark on Ashford, and while the night of terror had passed, the legacy of the blood moon would remain a shadow, watching, waiting for the day it would rise again. Final, unsettling, Evelyn turned away from Ashford, her heart heavy with the knowledge that some things, no matter how hard you try, can never be undone. The blood moon had set its mark upon the town, and the cycle had ended for now. But the question lingered, would Ashford ever truly be free, or was the blood moon's curse simply waiting for its return? The blood moon has set, its crimson light now a fading memory in the sky. Ashford, once trapped in the grip of its deepest fears and desires, now lies in the aftermath changed, forever marked by what it has endured. The curse has been broken, but the legacy of that night lingers in the minds of those who remain. The toll of the clock has stopped, but Ashford's story will continue to echo in the hearts of those who lived through it. The shadows may have receded, but they are never truly gone. The blood moon may rise again, and when it does, will Ashford be ready? Or will its inhabitants once again fall prey to the nightmare that lies within? Thank you for joining me on this journey through Ashford's dark history. If you've enjoyed this tale of fear, desire, and mystery, please make sure to subscribe and hit the bell for more chilling stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. And remember, midnight is always closer than you think. Good night, sleep well,